Hi, Facebook Live. Thank you so much for tuning in to our News 5 live conversation tonight. Tonight, we are discussing the verdict from the Derek Chauvin trial and how we move forward. There are a lot of things to address, especially when we talk about addressing reform with police officers and how to make things better between police officers and the community. And joining us, we have 3 guests tonight. We really appreciate them all being here. We will start with Mark Singer. Mark is a professor at Case Western Reserve University, and specifically he's with the Leonard Mayo Professor in Family and Child Welfare there at Case Western Reserve. Mark, thank you for being here. We also have Shari Runner. She is the president and CEO of the Humanity Institute. Shari, thank you so much for being with us. And then we also have our friend Danielle Syndor. She is the president of the Cleveland chapter, the local chapter of the NAACP. She's also the chief executive officer at We Win Strategies Group. Thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank
all
you.
Right.
Yes.
So we want to talk about how we move forward in light of this verdict. And Danielle and I, we talked yesterday a little bit about reaction to this verdict. I want you guys to weigh in. What was your reaction to this verdict when it came down? Some people are expressing relief. Some people have expressed a little bit of apprehension. Some people are optimistic now that we have a police officer who has been convicted of murder of a Black person. What was your immediate reaction?
So my personal reaction was I was glad that it happened, but not relieved, not thinking that this was the solution, that one thing had happened and changed everything. I believe that it was the right thing to happen, but we have a lot of work to do. And in terms of how we think about policing and what are the root causes of why these kinds of things keep happening and why we should even be questioning that there would have been a guilty verdict as it relates to the kind of behavior and activity that we saw when George Floyd was murdered.
Thank you, Shari. Mark, what about you?
My reaction was that I really hope that this becomes a landmark and that this moves things forward in very impactful ways, both in terms of legislation and in terms of major changes in how we do policing in this country.
Okay. And Danielle, I know we heard from you yesterday, but we'd love for you to repeat some of your sentiment.
Yeah, I think that it was mixed emotions because I think to Shari's point, I had a significant amount of hesitation about what the outcome would actually be, even though we saw George Floyd be murdered in cold blood. With the video evidence that was presented, it just was such a grueling process to think of all the things that had to happen to get us to this verdict. There was a bit of, sigh of relief, but also a recognition that it is simply one case. And it was because of the way that the jury was comprised, the prosecution's efforts in pulling this together. And so I just really hope that more prosecutors across the country pay attention to how this case was adjudicated. And we look to use those things as examples as we try and figure out how the rest of these cases potentially get brought before the judicial system.
Thank you, Danielle. Now, I just want to mention to our Facebook Live audience that if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything you want to put in the comments section, do so. We will try to address that in this conversation tonight, but we would love to hear from you. So go ahead and start typing away if you have something that you'd like to interject in this conversation. We'd love to hear from you as well. So I want to start and ask, when we talk about this trial against former police officer Derek Chauvin, there was an overwhelming amount of evidence. We had videos on top of videos on top of videos of what happened to George Floyd and what led up to his death. On top of that, we had protesting in the streets. We had a summer of protesting and boycotting and things of that nature to try to demand justice in this very case and several other cases, honestly, that we saw last spring and summer, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. So it seemed like it was an overwhelming amount of support from the community in general, from the country in general. Is it going to take that every time a police officer is on the line for the death or murder of a person of color?
I think that that's the bit of the concern right now, is that we will not have these types of stars, so to speak, aligning every single time there is an attempt to try and get justice in one of these cases. And so it really begs the question, what has to happen on the reform side before we get to this place? Because oftentimes the defenses that are used are, this was a part of our training. I think that was even the case in the Chauvin trial, is that some of the tactics that he used, there were expert witnesses that came to the stand and said the force was reasonable, the force was justified. And so if we can get to the place where we don't have a uniform system of what human interaction should be like, then we continue to have these sort of challenges, because unfortunately, we know that there are many more incidences that have happened. And we know that this trial would not have been the same without the video, because the initial headline released from the police department mentioned nothing of the things that we saw in that video. And so we have to demand that police are held accountable for telling the truth, and that departments are held accountable, especially now when we go back and see they lied in the initial headline. What's the accountability even for that?
And Danielle, I know you're referencing to the press release that was sent out by Minneapolis police. They called it a medical episode, that George Floyd died in custody due to a medical episode. And now we know what really happened once all the video was released. So I want to ask you guys, do you think this was a one-off? Do you think the tide is turning in this country for justice when it comes to Black people, especially involving police officers?
Well, I'm optimistic that this pointed out major flaws in how we do policing in this country. And it pointed it out on a level that I haven't seen previously. I think all of us, it was emotionally overwhelming. And you really got to see an individual suffer for a long period of time under really horrific police tactics that never should have been employed. And so I think that this must be carried forward in terms of what we do to change policing in this country. And again, as I had said earlier, it needs to be both through legislation, but it also needs to be with how we perceive police. And off camera, when I started, I said, a police force should be formed from the people, by the people, and for the people they serve. And that needs to be really a maxim for how we move forward.
So it seems like, Mark, what you're saying is in order to regulate or better regulate police officers, that the community needs to have input and say so in how this is all to happen.
More than input, the police need to be connected to the community. They need to be part of the community. You can't separate the two. Violence is much more likely to occur in a community with people that feel isolated and people that feel police officers are an occupying force, versus people that feel police officers are social responders, they're helpful to people, etc.
I think it's really critical to understand the role and history of policing as we start to talk about what it is that has to change. We often hear when we have incidences like this is that what's needed is better training. And I think training is not an issue around what makes a better policeman or what makes a better or more useful role for policemen in our communities. As we know, historically, police were to control slaves. And then as we industrialized and moved into cities, police were to control communities and neighborhoods. And as it followed several iterations and we became more involved with communities where crime and drugs were concentrated as a result of policy and structures, they were charged with managing the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on crime. And if you listen to the words and you listen to how the role of police is described, they have necessarily been trained in those tactics, which are a part of what it means to be an African American, or how an African American or African American community or brown communities or any kind of different other community is described. And so when these jobs are done, when you are using warlike tactics to control people, that becomes then the kind of thing that you're going to talk about in terms of whether or not this behavior is okay. And so we have to think of ways to reimagine what is it that police are needed to do in communities. And it may not be the domestic call. It may not be, the minor traffic stop. It may be something completely different. And it's very scary to the larger population when we start to talk about defund or reimagine, because those words start to take away some of this power that we've thought about of what the police can do to keep the status quo the way it is. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Shari. And it brings me to a point. I've been reading some of the comments that we're getting in from Facebook, but I want to highlight one of the comments we got from Ramo Jones. We need to reform the justice system, but he also says, start providing these officers with better training on how to de-escalate situations. That brings me precisely to what we saw yesterday as we were watching the verdict come down in the Derek Chauvin trial. Just a couple of 100 miles away from here in Columbus, we saw a 16-year-old girl, Ma'Khia Bryant, shot and killed by a police officer. They were responding to a call for a possible assault. And when they arrived, they found that this 16-year-old, this teenage girl, was wielding a knife. There was a police officer who jumped out of his vehicle with his gun blazing, no questions asked, and fired 4 shots and killed this 16-year-old girl. And there seems to be a little bit of remorse from the police department there in Columbus on this day. We ran a soundbite saying that he wishes that this would have been different, that it didn't play out this way. What is there to say about de-escalation tactics and police officer training in terms of being able to jump into a situation and respond maybe without the use of force?
It almost seems at this point that there is not a tactic that is provided to police besides deadly use of force. I mean, we see in so many situations where people are calling because they're in crisis and they end in death. And so it begs the question about how much time is spent on de-escalation. I know I've been involved in some conversations with law enforcement at various levels, and many will say they spend most of their time learning how to shoot to kill. That's the bulk of their training. And so when they do this, that's because that's what they've been trained to do, as opposed to thinking about other tactics and really the charge to preserve human life. And I wanted to go back to something that Shari said, because I have multiple siblings that are in the military. And I have a sister that's 2 years younger than me that ran from a hyena on base because she said anytime she discharged her service weapon, she had to write a report about it. And she would rather have run from the hyena than fill out the report and lodge that, particular incident. So when you talk about training, when you talk about the sanctity of life and the importance of how we condition officers to behave, we have examples of our military and other branches of the government where a weapon is not looked at as the first thing you go to preserve life. There are other means to do that. And so I really just challenge everybody who's quick to say, yes, the girl was acting in an unsafe manner. I don't disagree with that, but I have to believe that we have to have people that are brought into crisis situations to try and preserve everybody's life and not immediately look to end the scenario with somebody being dead.
And that may not be police all the time. And we have to maybe rethink how that kind of interaction can occur without people having to call police whose first training or first mind might be the implicit bias that they've grown up with over centuries, decades of thinking what it is they're facing when they go into communities of color. And so you're right. I mean, this is a very important distinction to be made about how people regard the people that they are protecting and serving.
Okay. And I do want to be fair about the Columbus situation with Ma'Khia Bryant. That officer, when he jumped out of the vehicle, several officers repeatedly told her to put the knife down. She did not comply. but it was within seconds of him jumping out of that vehicle is when he fired 4 times. And so now we know that she is dead. So when we talk about enforcing some sort of policy change among police officers, how does that look? Is that a federal initiative, or is that something that needs to be done on a state level, or both? And if so, what kinds of resolutions do you see on a federal level? What do you see on a state level?
Well, one of the things that I see on a state level is that state certification for police officers and training the board that oversees that should have more individuals who are familiar with de-escalation training, with family violence, etc., rather than just police chiefs, former police chiefs, etc. They need individuals from the community.
Yeah, and I think the other part of the reform, or what legislation looks like, is we know that the federal government absolutely can help to set the standard. We think about every individual state and municipality has different level of resources. When the federal government offers incentives, oftentimes behavior changes. If we look at the use of body cameras, there was opportunities for many local police departments to get reimbursements or dollars off of purchasing, equipment and things like that. And that has led to many more adopting the use of body cameras. So if there are some things that are mandated from a federal perspective in order for state governments and local governments to get resources, you see behavior change. And so I think it is something that needs to start at the federal level to offer some sort of consistency, because my biggest fear as a mother of 2 Black teenage sons is that I should be able to know if they are in Ohio or Florida, or if they're in Cleveland or Cincinnati, that they are going to engage with officers that have received the same mandates and same training and have the same resources, and not dealing with somebody who says, well, I just have volunteer cops who work on the weekend that we don't have any, resources to help afford train them.
I think also it's a critical point to make that, as we talked about earlier, that the idea of policing is just but one part of the criminal justice system. And so if you have communities that have been over-policed and people have been arrested for a variety of minor crimes, and they are being policed and gone after because they have a criminal record that is already overstated because of the way policing is done, then you begin to build up a defense for behavior that otherwise might not occur. And so we really have to take a look, I think, and that's probably the most important part for the federal government. Letting people who have been incorrectly incarcerated for long periods of time out of jail is not criminal justice reform. Criminal justice reform starts at the police and very minor levels where people start to get records. And so when we start to talk about reimagining policing and the impact that it has on communities, that's critically important to understand and to think about where the legislation takes place. Because you're right, we should all be safe. We should all feel that the police departments are there to help us and not harm us.
Let me double down on that if I can, just for one second.
Go ahead, Mark.
That's a notion. In this country, we have debtor's prison for individuals that have warrants for not being able to pay a fine, or not showing up in court because their car broke down, or et cetera, et cetera. And they are then apprehended for maybe going through a stop sign or speeding, and taken to jail just as they were a debtor. And these are for misdemeanors. This is for something they didn't have the money for, okay? And the repercussions of that. If you have a job, guess what? You lose it. In addition, you may lose your car, because if you're driving, you're gonna get it towed.
Okay. And
how much money is it gonna cost after you get out of jail? And by the way, do you have the bail money to get out of jail? So, we really have to concentrate on individuals who have maybe commit major crimes, and to leave these individuals who have very minor offenses. We have to create a better system for them.
So I want to ask you this. When we talk, how do we repair the relationship between people of color, African Americans, and the Latino community and police officers? You know, in Chicago, here in Cleveland, the Department of Justice intervened, and we saw consent decrees put in place for these police departments that they had to abide by certain rules and start cleaning up their departments. Now we know Minnesota, Minneapolis, they're getting ready. The Department of Justice is getting ready to intervene there. And, you know, I'm hopeful that that doesn't happen here in Ohio, particularly in Columbus, where we saw 2 fatal police shootings in the last week. How do we clean up the relationship and mend the relationship between people of color and police officers? It seems to me that it's going to take more than just federal intervention and a list of things that the departments have to do. Like, it seems that those officers and the departments really have to have a concerted effort to want to make a better relationship between them and the people that they police.
I think what we saw happen in the this past trial is an example of police holding each other accountable, which oftentimes we don't see. I mean, you hear all the time, you know, asking people to tell if you know something, if you hear something, if you see something, say something. And then we hear this conversation about the thin blue line and the brotherhood and, you know, not saying anything when you know an officer is doing wrong, just pulling them to the side. And so we cannot ask communities to be more accountable to the truth than we're asking police officers. We cannot mend a relationship if individuals won't first come and say, I've been abusing you and I'm committed to stopping. And so I think that that's the issue, is that we're not seeing enough recognition without these consent decrees coming from places like the Department of Justice before we get to the place where there's an acknowledgement. I mean, in the case of the Cleveland consent decree, we still don't have an acknowledgement that anything was done wrong. If you talk to Chief Calvin Williams today, he'll tell you the city nor the police department has agreed that these findings were accurate and truthful, but they have they didn't have any other choice. So if we're still saying that in 2021, that we didn't do anything wrong, but the Department of Justice said we did, so, you know, we're going to agree to this. That's the issue, is that we don't have enough leadership in police departments that are saying, yes, we have a problem and we want to work with you to fix it. It's still us versus them in most of these situations.
I mean, I think if there's anything that we can say that's happened recently in the past several years, is the issue of race, and the fact that we have a race problem in the country is real. And we have to put our shoulders down and deal with that. And we have to be able to deal with the fact that we've got a lot of scarring and issues around how to deal with that. And police and communities come to the table with their own preconceived notions, their own implicit biases about who one another are and how they and what they do to their communities. So I think that trying to change that, trying to legislate that, is near impossible. But putting in place other systems and acknowledging that this may not be the one is probably the way to go. And it creates, you know, until the advent of the body cam and the smartphone, nobody believed that policemen could possibly do the things that they were accused of. Now we see it for ourselves, and you have to believe your eyes. And so now we have to have a conversation about the reality of what is going on. And we cannot abuse this cultural issue that we have. And that's being done every day. Every single time we have an issue, it is political. It is not factual. It is not something that we really are trying to change.
And Shari, I think it also goes back to what you said at the beginning of the conversation, is you have to consider what police departments were created for. And as you said, to police slaves. And I think many departments to this day have moved forward and replaced the term slaves. as Black people or people of color. And so until we acknowledge that and move forward, that's the only way we can move forward, is to acknowledge that was the past, but we need to change that and change that concept. Mark, I'm sorry, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I think I completely agree with that, but I just want to widen the view a little bit. Let's also talk about real estate, bank loans, voting rights,
Yes.
hospital care. Let's go down the line with it. And the entire system. I mean, I know we're here to talk about police, and I'm not trying to deflect, but that's not where it begins and ends.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, because there are inequities in all of those areas that you mentioned, in terms of Black people being able to purchase real estate and attain jobs, and it's systematic, and that's what Black people have been crying out for centuries. It's systematic. Since we've come out of slavery, we have made inches in progress, but this country has to do better. So what is your hope for the near future? I'll ask you guys. We had this verdict that came down. Seemed like a lot of people were very hopeful, and are hopeful that it'll change something. Do you think it is turning the tide? Do you think people in this country are starting to realize this is a problem and we really need to act?
I think that people are. If you look at the number of individuals, the number of organizations that reached out, that made statements after the murder of George Floyd, I would say part of me was initially frustrated that was like, it took this particular case for people to kind of recognize something was going on. But it also made me say, well, more people actually are recognizing what's going on. And so I believe that as we look at it from across the system, people can't go back and unsee what they saw. They can't forget this case. And so now when we think about people getting called for jury duty, may it be something, maybe a lower level offense, hopefully they empathize more with the person that's the defendant or the victim, especially as people of color that are often, to Shari's point earlier, overcharged and over penalized with crimes that have tougher and higher sentencing. We've got to be able to make sure that people have more empathy as they're going into this process.
I think it's really critical that we not stop, that this is not just a thing that happened and it's not just an event, that we really use this to move forward and change systems. We have been here before. We have been at a place where we are at an inflection point, and we must not waste the lives that have been lost over the last several years in particular, but for history. And we must do something and acknowledge that this is a real problem that really needs to be dealt with.
Do you believe that we need to address racism in this country before we can address police reform? Do you feel like racism overlaps into police reform more times than not? Because when you look at our police departments, even in major cities where you may see people of color have the greater population in these urban areas, but our police departments don't reflect those cities. So the reality is that the likelihood that a person of color is going to encounter an officer that doesn't look like them is very great. How important is it to address racism when we talk about police reform?
I think it's important. And I think to Mark's point specifically, policing is but one tool of a very large system. And it's very important that we consider that factor when we consider changing systems with all of these things: intergenerational wealth transfer, education, housing, healthcare. All of these things have a component of race, so we have to acknowledge it. And we can't even, there's no way in the world under these circumstances that we can ignore it right now. It's in your face every day. And, maybe that's what it's going to take.
Yeah, just to add one thing to that is I think we look at so many communities where you can almost draw parallel lines to the level of disparity and the incidences of police violence, because communities that are more concentrated with poverty tend to have higher crime rates. You can overlay redlining on all of these maps of health disparities, and you also see the same sorts of issues in policing. And so what we know is if we dealt with the underlying economic conditions and root causes, then we wouldn't have as much of a need for police in our country, in my opinion, the way that we use them today.
My last question, because we're actually overtime right now, we're in overtime. Do any of you agree with the notion of defunding the police? Because there were calls for that. We heard a lot of calls for that last summer.
I don't even know what that means, frankly. I think reformulating how we fund police and how we train police is a good idea, and we should do it. But if you defund police, what are you left with, I guess?
Mm-hmm. I have a friend that always says you have to have radical imagination. So there was no incentive to abolish slavery. There's no incentive to abolish the police, but it doesn't mean it won't work. And I think that we have to have radical imagination to say, how could our communities look different if different people responded to scenarios where we're in crisis, where someone simply needs help? Yes, there has to be somebody to respond to active shooter situations where there are violent things that are being perpetrated. But today we know that somebody who has an outstanding ticket or warrant could end up dead because a person that approached them, had a service weapon and thought that was the best thing to use.
I believe that defund the police is rhetoric. It's a hot button name for something that we know has to happen, which is reimagining the role of police and how they're used and what is the best role for other people in situations which police cannot and should not be trained to manage. So I think just saying defund the police is something that's used to rile up a certain segment of society for the purpose of making sure that we get nothing done.
I look forward to the day when we can see police officers, community partners, and people looking forward to seeing your local police officer drive down the street and not be in fear. And I saw that quite a bit in Chicago.
Yes.
Which is where I'm from and where I was before I came to Cleveland. So I'm really hopeful that this will help to turn the tide. But Mark Singer, Danielle Syndor, and Shari Runner, I appreciate you guys participating in our conversation to talk about the verdict and what's to come, what's next in this country. Are there any final comments you guys want to put out there before we leave?
Thank you for having the conversation and continuing. It's what's needed so much.
Thank you for helping us out.
Yep.
Thank you guys so much for participating. And thank you, Facebook Live, for joining us tonight. We appreciate you. You guys have a safe and